H1, Galaxy Council sent 9,000 ships to invade Earth. All others disappeared. H2, Part 1, The Council's Decree. HR. The meeting hall of the Galactic Council was enormous. It was so large that the ceiling could not be seen from the floor. Hundreds of alien delegates sat in curved rows that stretched upward like a giant bowl. The air was thick with the smell of different alien atmospheres being pumped through individual breathing tubes. Lights flickered in colors that human eyes had never seen. And at the center of it all, standing on the main platform, was Admiral Veron of the Drakai Empire. Veron was tall. His skin was dark gray and covered in thin ridges that ran from his jaw to the back of his skull. His eyes were yellow and did not blink often. He had commanded wars across 6 star systems and had never lost a single one. He was not a creature that was used to being told no. And today, he was very angry. He slammed his 4-fingered hand on the podium, and the sound echoed through the entire hall. "Enough," he said. His voice was low and heavy, like a stone dragged across metal. "We have discussed this for 3 full cycles. The decision must be made today." The delegate from the Orani Collective raised a thin arm. "Admiral Varen, the humans have not attacked anyone. They have only expanded to their neighboring moons. That is not an act of war." Varen turned his yellow eyes toward the delegate. "Not yet," he said. "But look at their history. Look at what they have done to their own planet. They fought each other for thousands of years. They burned their own forests. They poisoned their own oceans. And still they survived. Still they grew. Still they reached the stars." He paused and looked around the room. "Civilizations like that do not stop. They never stop. And if we wait until they are strong enough to threaten us, it will be too late." There was silence in the hall. The Galactic Council had 47 member civilizations. Some of them had been traveling through space for over 10,000 years. Some of them had watched entire stars go dark. They were old and wise and careful. But they were also afraid. And fear, even in the oldest and wisest of creatures, has a way of winning arguments. The vote was held. 41 civilizations voted in favor of action. 6 voted against. The decision was made. 9,000 warships would be sent to Earth. The news reached Earth 3 days later, picked up by a deep space listening station on the far edge of the solar system. The signal was not encrypted. The Council had not bothered to hide it. They did not think humanity was advanced enough to intercept and decode long-range galactic transmissions. They were wrong. The decoded message was delivered to Colonel Desu at exactly 4:47 in the morning, Seoul time. He was already awake. Desu was not a man who slept much. He was in his early 50s, with short dark hair that had started going gray at the temples. He was not very tall, and he was not very loud. He spoke in short, clear sentences, and he almost never raised his voice. The people who worked under him respected him not because he was impressive to look at, but because he was always right. In 15 years of working in Earth's Global Defense Command, he had never once panicked, not even close. He read the decoded message twice. Then he set it down on his desk and looked out the window at the city below. Seoul was quiet at this hour. Street lights reflected off the wet pavement. A few vehicles moved slowly through the empty roads. Somewhere far below, a dog was barking. Desu picked up his radio. "Wake everyone up," he said. "We have guests coming." Within 20 minutes, the underground levels of Defense Command were fully operational. Screens lit up across every wall. Officers moved quickly to their stations. Coffee was made in large quantities. Lieutenant Yuna arrived still pulling on her jacket, her short hair slightly messy, a tablet already in her hand. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes that took in everything at once. She had been recruited directly from the Space Monitoring Division 2 years ago, and was considered one of the best signal analysts in the building. She walked straight to Desu's side and looked at the main screen, which now showed a map of the galaxy with a thick red line moving from a distant star cluster toward the Sol system. 9,000 ships, she said quietly. Yes, said Desu. How long do we have? At their current speed, approximately 18 days. Yuna stared at the screen for a moment. Are they expecting a fight? Desu almost smiled. No, he said. They are expecting a surrender. Across the planet, in a deep underground facility in the port city of Busan, a man named Hyun Tae was already sitting at his workstation when the alert came through. He was an engineer, though that word did not really cover what he did. He was the kind of person who could look at a broken alien power cell that nobody else understood and have it running again in 2 hours. He had been doing that kind of work for 12 years, ever since Earth had quietly begun collecting and studying every piece of alien technology it could find. Downed probes, crashed scout ships, intercepted devices drifting through the outer solar system. Hyun Tae read the alert, then turned to the large console in front of him and began typing. Around him, the facility hummed. Deep in the walls, behind layers of rock and steel and shielding that blocked every kind of scan the Council's technology was capable of performing, machines were waiting. They had been waiting for a long time. They were very patient, in the way that machines always are. They did not know what they were waiting for, but Hyun Tae did. He typed one final command, and then leaned back in his chair. The console in front of him lit up. One by one, status indicators across the entire board began turning green. Hundreds of them, then thousands, spread across every continent, every ocean floor, every mountain range on Earth. Hidden structures that the Galactic Council had no idea existed began to wake up. Hyun Tae looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. They actually came, he said to no one in particular. Good. Back in the Council's meeting hall, Admiral Veron stood before a tactical display showing the route of the fleet. 9,000 ships, the largest military force the galaxy had assembled in 400 years. He watched the slow movement of the fleet markers with satisfaction. He had expected fear from the humans. He had expected panicked transmissions, desperate attempts at diplomacy, maybe a few small ships scrambling into space in a futile show of resistance. What he got was silence. No transmissions, no movement, no response of any kind. His communications officer looked up from her station. Admiral, there is no signal from Earth. They are not responding. Veron clasped his hands behind his back. They are afraid, he said simply. They know what is coming. He was right that they knew what was coming. He was very wrong about the fear. Galaxy Council sent 9,000 ships to invade Earth. All others disappeared. H2, Part 2, Earth Responds. HR. 18 days was not a lot of time. But for the people inside Global Defense Command, it was enough. Colonel Desu had not slept in 36 hours by the time the full situation report landed on his desk. He read through it standing up, holding a cup of cold coffee that he had forgotten to drink. Around him, the underground facility was running at full capacity. Every department was active. Every team was working. The place smelled like sweat and instant noodles and printer paper. Nobody complained. Nobody asked to go home. People had been waiting their entire careers for something like this, even if they had never said it out loud. The situation report was long, but the important part was simple. Earth was not defenseless. It had never been defenseless. It had simply been quiet. For the past 2 centuries, every nation on Earth had contributed, in secret, to a single long-term project, with no official name and no public announcement. Scientists called it different things, depending on which department they worked in. Engineers called it the grid. Defense officers called it the network. The politicians who knew about it, and not many did, called it the answer. Whatever name was used, the idea was the same. Earth had been studying alien technology for 200 years, quietly, carefully, and with extraordinary patience. and it had built something with what it had learned. Daesu set down the report and looked at the main display. "Lieutenant Yuna," he said. She was at his side in seconds. "Sir." "Send the response signal." Yuna nodded and walked to her station. She sat down, cracked her knuckles once out of habit, and began composing the message. She had been thinking about what to say for the past day and a half, and had gone through dozens of drafts in her head. Every version she had considered was too long, too emotional, too human in the wrong way. What was needed was something simple, something that made the situation perfectly clear without explaining anything that didn't need to be explained. She finished typing and looked at the screen for a moment. The message read, "You have entered restricted space. Turn back." She sent it. On the bridge of the Drakai flagship, the communications officer stared at her screen. She read the message twice, then a third time, then turned slowly toward Admiral Varan. "Admiral," she said carefully, "we have received a transmission from Earth." Varan turned from the tactical display. "Finally. What do they say? Are they surrendering?" "No, Admiral. They are telling us to turn back." There was a long pause on the bridge. Then Varan laughed. It was a short, hard sound, like something breaking. Around him, other officers on the bridge shifted uncomfortably. A few of them exchanged glances. They had all seen what 9,000 warships looked like from the inside of the fleet. They had all done the numbers. The Drakai Empire alone had firepower capable of cracking a moon. 9,000 ships from 47 civilizations combined was not something a single primitive planet could threaten. And yet, some of those officers had studied human history. Not deeply, but enough. They knew that humans had a strange habit of doing things that were not supposed to be possible. Varan stopped laughing. "Send no reply," he said. "Continue course." 14 days before the fleet arrived, a woman named Rena boarded a small transport vessel at a private spaceport in Incheon and left Earth. She did not tell anyone where she was going, except for Daesu, and even he only knew the destination and not the details of the plan she was carrying in her head. Rena was a captain in name, though she had not commanded a conventional military unit in years. Her real job was something that did not appear on any official document. She had spent the last 6 years embedded inside the Galactic Council's administrative station, working under a false identity as a low-level records officer from a small, politically unimportant civilization. She had a talent for being overlooked. She was quiet and polite and smiled at the right moments and asked no questions that made people uncomfortable. In 6 years, not one council member had looked at her twice. She was exactly where she needed to be. When she arrived at the council station 11 days later, she went straight to her small office, sat down at her desk, and began doing her actual job. The other job. Back on Earth, Hyun-tae had not left the Busan facility in 2 weeks. He slept in a cot near his workstation and ate meals that a junior technician brought to him on a tray. He barely noticed. He was too busy watching the grid come fully online, one section at a time. The grid was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not fire anything. It did not explode. It did not burn. What it did was far more elegant, and in many ways, far more frightening. It moved things. Specifically, it moved things through space in a way that violated several principles the Galactic Council considered to be absolute laws of physics. Humanity had figured out a workaround. It had taken 2 centuries of work and an enormous amount of reverse-engineered alien technology to do it. But the result was a planetary-scale displacement system capable of reaching out across hundreds of thousands of kilometers and relocating any object to any other point in space, instantly. The Council's fleet was enormous, but enormous things were still things, and things could be moved. Hyun-tae ran another calibration check. All systems were green. He pulled up a targeting map that showed the incoming fleet as a cluster of tiny dots moving slowly toward a small blue circle at the center of the display. He watched the dots move. He checked his numbers. He ran the calibration again. Everything was perfect. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. A junior technician appeared at his shoulder and handed him a cup of tea. He took it without looking away from the screen. "How long until they reach the perimeter?" the technician asked. 4 days, said Hunte. "Are you nervous?" Hunte thought about it. The fleet was 9,000 ships. The combined firepower was enough to reduce Earth to rubble several times over if even a fraction of it got through. The targeting system had never been tested at full scale. The power requirements alone were staggering. There were 100 things that could go wrong. He took a sip of tea. "No," he said. "Run it again. I want another calibration before I sleep." On the day the fleet reached the outer edge of the solar system, Desu called a full briefing in the main operations room. He stood in front of a large display showing the fleet's position and looked at the faces of every person in the room. They were tired. They had all been working for weeks without proper rest. Some of them were scared. Fear was a reasonable response to 9,000 warships. He did not think less of them for it. He spoke for 4 minutes. He kept it simple. He told them what was going to happen, what their jobs were, and what he expected from each department. He did not make any speeches about humanity, or destiny, or the future. He was not that kind of man. He just told them the facts. When he finished, he asked if there were any questions. Nobody had any. "Good," he said. "Get back to work." He returned to his desk, sat down, and watched the dots on the screen move closer. The fleet would reach the lunar perimeter in 3 days. Galaxy Council sent 9,000 ships to invade Earth. All others disappeared. Part 3. The disappearance begins. The first ships to cross the lunar perimeter were not chosen because they were weak. They were chosen because they were strong. Admiral Varan had sent his best forward units into the approach. 300 warships from the Drakai Empire's 1st Combat Division, the most decorated and battle-tested fleet group in galactic history. They had flattened 2 civilizations in the past century alone. Their shields were thick. Their weapons were powerful. Their commanders were experienced and calm. They crossed the boundary at exactly the agreed formation time, spread across a wide front to prevent any concentrated counterattack. Their sensors were active. Their weapons were charged. Their crews were at battle stations. Every instrument on every ship was functioning normally. Then, they were gone. No flash of light, no explosion, no debris field, no distress signal, no final transmission, no warning of any kind. 300 of the most powerful warships in the galaxy simply ceased to exist on every scanner and tracking system the fleet had. One moment they were there, moving in clean formation. The next moment the space they had occupied was completely empty. The remaining fleet came to a full stop. On the bridge of the flagship, the silence lasted for almost 10 seconds. That was a long time on a military bridge during an active operation. Officers stared at their screens. Some of them tapped their instruments, thinking there was a malfunction. Some of them looked at each other. One junior officer made a small, involuntary sound that was not quite a word. Admiral Varan stood very still at the center of the bridge. "Report," he said. His tactical officer's voice was steady, but only barely. "Admiral, 300 ships of the 1st Division have disappeared from all tracking systems. There are no energy signatures, no wreckage, no signal of any kind. It is as if they were never there. Weapon signatures? Did something fire on them? No, Admiral. There was no energy discharge, no projectile, no beam, nothing. They are simply gone." Varan said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the empty space on the tactical display where 300 markers had just been. He had been in wars. He had seen ships destroyed. He knew what destruction looked like. The blooming energy of an explosion, the scatter of debris, the broken signals of a dying vessel. He had never seen anything like this. This was not destruction. This was erasure. "Pull the fleet back 200,000 kilometers," he said, "and send a message to the council. Tell them what has happened." His communications officer looked up. "What exactly should I say, Admiral?" Veron looked at the empty screen. "Tell them that we have a problem," he said quietly. The Galactic Council received the message 7 hours later. The session that followed was the loudest and most chaotic in the Council's 4,000-year history. Delegates shouted over each other. 3 separate fistfights nearly broke out between species whose physical forms were capable of fighting. The representative from the Orani Collective, one of the 6 who had voted against the invasion, stood at her podium for 20 minutes trying to be heard over the noise, before finally giving up and sitting back down. In a small side office just off the main hall, Rena sat at her desk and listened to the chaos through the thin walls. She had a data tablet in her hand, and on it was a live feed from Earth's tracking systems, sent to her through a channel that nobody on the Council station knew existed. She could see the fleet's position. She could see the empty space where the 1st Division had been. She could see the grid status indicators showing a clean, successful displacement event. She set the tablet face down on her desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up a plain cup of water from her desk, raised it slightly, and took a quiet sip. It was as close to a celebration as her current situation allowed. In Busan, Hyun-tae was standing at his main console when the displacement completed. He had watched every step of it in real time. The power draw had been enormous. For about 4 seconds, a measurable portion of Earth's total power grid had been redirected through the grid's relay network. It had been calculated and planned for, but seeing the numbers on his screen in real time was still something. The lights in the facility had actually dimmed slightly, which nobody had predicted. He made a note about that. The displaced ships had been sent to a predetermined location beyond the galactic edge, far enough to be completely out of any strategic position, but not so far that the crews would be in danger. The ships themselves were intact. Their engines still worked. Their life support systems were still running. Everyone on board those 300 ships was alive and completely unharmed, just very, very far away from where they had been a moment ago. That had been intentional. Earth did not want to destroy the fleet. It wanted to demonstrate something. There was a significant difference between the two. A junior technician named Woo-jin appeared at Hyun-tae's side. He was young, maybe 24, and he had been working in the facility for only 8 months. He had done his job well during the operation, monitoring power flow in Sector 9 without a single error. But right now, he just looked stunned. "That actually worked," said Woo-jin. "Of course it worked," said Hyun-tae without looking up from his console. "But 300 ships, all at once. The system is rated for 500 simultaneous displacements at maximum load." Hyun-tae typed a few commands and pulled up the next targeting sequence. 300 was not a stretch. Woo-jin stared at the screen. "How many are left in the fleet?" 8,700. Woo-jin was quiet for a moment. "And we can move all of them?" Hyun-tae finally looked up. He studied the young technician's face for a second. Then he nodded, once, and looked back at his screen. "When do we move the next group?" Woo-jin asked. "We wait," said Hyun-tae. "For what?" "For them to do something." The fleet did something. Admiral Veron, after 2 hours of silence and 4 more failed attempts to reach the missing 1st Division ships by long-range transmission, gave a new order. He sent a second group forward. This one was smaller. 50 ships, mostly scanning and communications vessels, with only light weapons. His intention was not to attack, but to gather information. He needed to know what had happened to the 1st Division. He needed to understand what Earth had done, and how, before he could make any further decisions. The 50 ships moved forward slowly, with every sensor they had running at maximum output. They scanned the area where the first division had been. They found nothing. No residual energy, no spatial distortion, no traces of anything at all. Whatever Earth had used, it left no fingerprint. They crossed the line where the first division had disappeared. And then, they too were gone. Back on the flagship bridge, Veron stood completely still for a very long time. His yellow eyes did not blink. The bridge around him was so quiet that the hum of the life support system was audible. Then he turned and walked to his command chair. He sat down slowly, like a man who was very tired, and stared at the empty tactical display. "Hold position," he said. "No further ships are to advance. No one moves." His first officer stepped closer. "Admiral, what are your orders?" Veron was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but something in it had changed. Something that had always been there, a certainty, a heaviness that came from decades of winning, was gone. "I don't know yet," he admitted. It was the first time in 40 years that Admiral Veron had said those words. Galaxy Council sent 9,000 ships to invade Earth. All others disappeared. Part 4. The Truth Unveiled. The Galactic Council had been in emergency session for 19 straight hours. By the time the session reached its 19th hour, most of the delegates had stopped talking and were simply sitting in their chairs looking at the main display, which showed the current status of the fleet. The fleet was holding position. 350 ships were missing. No explanation had been found. Several of the most advanced scientific minds in the galaxy had been contacted and given every piece of data available, and all of them had given the same answer in different words. "We do not know what happened." The delegate from the Sarathi Federation, a quiet and elderly creature who had said very little during the original vote to send the fleet, now sat in the front row with his long fingers folded together and watched the display. He had lived for 600 years. He had seen civilizations rise and fall. He recognized what was happening, even if he could not name the mechanism behind it. He had seen it before, in a different form, a long time ago. A young civilization that everyone had underestimated. A technology that nobody had predicted. A silence that turned out to be not fear, but preparation. He said nothing. He simply watched and waited. The transmission from Earth came in at the Council's 44th hour of emergency session. It was not a text message this time. It was a live visual broadcast, which meant that Earth had the capability to send real-time signals across the distance between its star system and the Council station. A feat that most civilizations at Earth's supposed stage of development could not perform. Several delegates noted this with visible discomfort. A few of them had begun to understand that the file they had on humanity was very, very incomplete. The broadcast opened on a plain gray room. The camera angle was straightforward and unremarkable. There were no decorations, no flags, no symbols of any kind behind the speaker. It looked like a storage room or a conference space that had been cleared of everything except the person standing in it. That person was Colonel Day-Su. He was in his regular uniform. No medals, though he had several he was entitled to wear. He had deliberately left them off. He did not want to look ceremonial. He wanted to look like exactly what he was, a working officer, mid-briefing, explaining a situation to people who needed to understand it. He looked at the camera and began speaking. His voice was calm and even. He did not rush. He spoke clearly enough that the Council's translation systems had no difficulty converting his words into the 47 languages of the member civilizations simultaneously. He told them the truth. He told them that Earth had been aware of galactic civilization for 230 years, ever since the first alien probe had malfunctioned and drifted into the inner solar system. He told them that Earth had recovered that probe, studied it, and kept its existence completely secret. He told them that over the following 2 centuries, Earth had recovered and studied 11 more alien devices. Probes, a crashed scout ship, sensor arrays, 3 separate communications relays that had been carelessly left in the outer solar system, and had used all of them as the foundation for a self-developed research program. He told them about the grid, not in full technical detail, but enough. He explained that it was a planetary-scale displacement system, a network of linked structures embedded in Earth's surface, oceans, and crust, capable of reaching out and moving any object to any other point in space without warning and without any traceable energy signature. He told them it had taken 200 years to build, and that it was fully operational. He told them that the 350 missing ships were alive, their crews were unharmed, they had been moved to a location beyond the galactic edge, and their ship's engines were functional. They could return home whenever the Council chose to retrieve them. Then he paused for exactly 3 seconds. The remaining 8,650 ships of your fleet are currently within grid targeting range, he said. They have been within range for the past 9 hours. We have not moved them. We want to be clear that this is a choice, not a limitation. He paused again. We would like to propose a negotiation. The council session, which had been running on stunned silence for most of the broadcast, erupted the moment the transmission ended. Inside her small office, Rena heard the noise through the walls, and this time it was louder than before. She stood up, smoothed her jacket, picked up the data tablet, and walked out into the corridor. Her job in the next phase was simple. She had a list of 6 specific delegates who needed to receive a secondary communication from Earth, a private message sent through a separate channel containing additional technical documentation that would confirm everything Daesu had just said. Her job was to ensure those messages were delivered to the right people and that the right people actually read them. She moved through the crowded corridors of the council station with the calm efficiency of someone who had been invisible in this building for 6 years and knew exactly how to stay that way. She knocked on the first door on her list. Back in Busan, scientist Bora had been awake for almost 2 days. She was the lead researcher on the grid's theoretical framework, the person who, 15 years ago, had written the original paper proposing that displacement at scale was mathematically possible. Nobody had believed her at first. Several prominent scientists had publicly criticized her work. She had kept going anyway. She was that kind of person. She was sitting at a side desk in the main operations room now, running through the technical documentation that Daesu would need to present to the council if negotiations moved to a detailed phase. It was a carefully prepared package, enough to prove that everything he had said was real, without giving away the full specifications of the grid's design, or its exact capabilities. She printed the final version, clipped it together, and walked to the front of the room where Daesu was standing with 2 senior officers reviewing something on a tablet. She held out the document without interrupting the conversation. He took it without looking away from the tablet, glanced at the cover page, and nodded once. Bora went back to her desk and opened a new file. There was still a lot of work to do. Admiral Varen watched the full broadcast from his command chair. He did not move during it. When it ended, the bridge was very quiet. He sat there for a long time after the screen went dark. He thought about the vote in the council chamber. He thought about the words he had said, about how civilizations like humanity never stopped, how they were a threat that had to be addressed before they became too strong to handle. He had believed every word of it when he said it. He still believed it was true, in a general sense. He just had not expected them to already be there. His first officer stepped forward carefully. "Admiral, your orders?" Varen thought about it. He thought about the 9,000 ships behind him, none of which could do anything about a weapon that left no trace, and gave no warning. He thought about the 350 ships that were currently sitting somewhere beyond the galactic edge, their crews alive and waiting. He thought about what would happen if he gave the order to advance, and 8,000 more ships simply vanished. "Maintain position," he said. His voice was controlled and flat. "Do not advance. Do not retreat. We wait for the council." His first officer nodded and stepped back. Veron looked at the small blue dot on the tactical display that represented Earth. He looked at it for a long time. He had been in 40 wars and had never lost. He had a good sense for the moment when a battle turned, when the shape of a conflict changed, and what had seemed like a certain outcome became something else entirely. He had learned, in 40 years of fighting, to recognize that moment and respond to it correctly, rather than pretending it had not happened. He was looking at that moment right now. He had come here expecting to find a primitive world, a young species with sharp elbows and bad habits that needed to be contained before it became a problem. He had expected rudimentary technology, maybe a few defensive ships, possibly some brave but futile resistance that would be over within a day. Instead, he had found something that the entire Galactic Council, with 4,000 years of accumulated knowledge and technology, had not predicted. He had found a civilization that had been quietly watching them for 2 centuries, learning from everything they had carelessly left behind, and building something in secret that none of them had imagined was possible. He clasped his hands behind his back and kept his eyes on the display. The negotiations were about to begin, and for the first time in his life, Admiral Veron was not the one deciding the terms. Galaxy Council sent 9,000 ships to invade Earth. All others disappeared. Part 5. A New Order. The negotiations lasted 6 days. They were conducted through a secure long-range channel that Earth had established without asking the Council's permission. This detail alone told every senior delegate something important. The channel used a transmission protocol that the Council's best communications engineers spent 2 full days trying to analyze, and at the end of those 2 days, their conclusion was that it was based on technology they did not recognize and could not fully explain. Earth had not invented it from nothing. Parts of it were clearly derived from known galactic systems. But what had been done with those parts was something no one in the Council had seen before. Humanity had taken pieces of other people's work, understood them better than the people who made them, and built something new. The lead negotiator on Earth's side was Daesu. He sat in the same plain gray room for all 6 days, sometimes with Bora at a table beside him with documents and data, sometimes alone. He was patient. He answered questions without evasion. He gave technical confirmation where the Council required it, and declined politely but firmly where he felt the request went beyond what was necessary for the negotiation. The Council's lead negotiator was a senior delegate named Oru from the Sarathi Federation, the same elderly delegate who had sat quietly in the front row and said nothing during the chaos after the first ships disappeared. He had been chosen because he was the oldest and most experienced diplomat the Council had, and also because he had voted against the invasion from the beginning. Earth had specifically requested that the negotiating team not include anyone who had voted for the fleet's dispatch. The Council had agreed, which was itself a significant concession. He was methodical and unhurried. He asked about the grid, not its full specifications, but its range, its limitations, and its theoretical vulnerabilities. Daesu answered some of these and declined others, always explaining briefly why. Oru accepted this without argument. He was old enough to understand that the purpose of a negotiation was not to learn everything, but to reach an agreement. On the 3rd day, Oru asked a question that was not on anyone's official agenda. "How long have you known," he said slowly, "that the Council was watching you?" Daesu was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 191 years. Oru was still, and in all that time you said nothing. We had nothing to gain from saying something, said Desu, and a great deal to gain from listening. Then he made a small gesture with one hand. Not quite a nod, something more complex than that. Something that in his culture signified a kind of deep and reluctant respect. He said nothing more on that subject. On the 5th day, Rena appeared. She had been summoned by Oru, who had known for some time, he was not easy to fool at 600 years old, that there was someone inside the council station who was not quite what they appeared to be. He had known for about 3 years, but had chosen not to act on it, partly because he was curious, and partly because as the vote on the invasion approached, he had begun to suspect that having someone like that in place might end up being more useful than not. Rena sat in a chair across from Oru in his private office, not because she had been caught, but because the negotiation was now at a stage where secrecy no longer served any purpose, and because Desu had given her clearance to make the disclosure. She told him how long she had been there. She told him what she had been doing. She told him how Earth had obtained the credentials she had used, and how the communications channel had been maintained. Oru listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her. 6 years, he said. Yes, said Rena. And in 6 years not one person here identified you? No. Oru was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, was there anyone else? Rena smiled slightly. I'm not going to answer that. He made that same small gesture again, the one that meant reluctant respect, and moved on. The treaty was signed on the 6th day. It was called the Soul Accord, which was Earth's suggestion. The Council had wanted a longer and more formal name. Earth had declined. Short names were easier to remember and harder to misinterpret, Desu had said. And after 6 days of negotiations, the Council's team was tired enough to agree with almost anything that moved the process forward. The terms were not complicated. They had been drafted by Bora over several weeks before the fleet had even arrived. Because Earth had anticipated that if things went according to plan, a treaty would be needed, and it was better to have one ready than to write one under pressure. The Council agreed to recognize Earth as a sovereign apex civilization, a classification that had existed in the Council's legal framework for 4,000 years, but had never once been applied to any species. The classification carried specific protections. No member civilization could conduct military operations within a sovereign apex's territory. No member civilization could place economic or political restrictions on a sovereign apex without consent. And most importantly, a sovereign apex civilization had full veto rights over any council resolution that directly affected its territory or people. In exchange, Earth agreed to release all displaced ships immediately and in full. It agreed to share certain non-critical elements of grid research with the Council's scientific community over a negotiated timeline, and it agreed to maintain a permanent diplomatic presence at the Council station. That last point had been added by Earth, not the Council. When Oru pointed this out that Earth had asked to be present, not the other way around, Desu had looked at him and said simply, "We would rather be in the room than outside it." Oru had nodded very slowly and written it into the document. The displaced ships were returned within 4 hours of the signing. Hyuntae ran the retrieval sequence himself, watching as the grid reversed the displacement events one group at a time, moving vessels from deep void space back to their original positions in an orderly sequence. It took 2 hours and 14 minutes. The system performed flawlessly, which he noted without any particular celebration. It was supposed to perform flawlessly. That was the point of running 217 calibration tests. Wu Jin stood beside him through the whole process, watching the markers reappear on the tracking display one by one. When the last ship reappeared and the board showed full retrieval complete, Wu Jin let out a long breath. "That's all of them," he said. "Yes," said Hyuntae. "We did it." Hyuntae looked at the display for a moment. Then he started shutting down the active targeting sequences, one section at a time. The grid would remain on standby. It would always remain on standby from now on. But there was no reason to keep it at full operational load, now that the immediate situation had been resolved. "Go home," he said to Wu Jin. "Sleep." Wu Jin looked at him. "What about you?" "I have a few more things to check." Hyuntae typed a command, and watched a bank of indicators shift from green to amber, the standby color. "Then go home without me," he said. "I'll be done soon." Wu Jin picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He looked at the display one more time, at the clean and orderly map of the solar system, with no hostile markers anywhere on it. Then he left. Hyuntae worked for another 2 hours. When he finally shut down his station, he was the last person left in the facility. He walked through the empty corridors, turned off the lights in each room as he passed through, and took the elevator up to ground level. Outside, it was early morning. The air was cold and smelled like the sea. The sky above Busan was beginning to go from dark blue to lighter blue at the edges, the first hint of dawn coming over the water. He stood there for a moment in the quiet. Then he decided he wanted noodles. He walked to the only place in the neighborhood that was open this early, a small restaurant 3 blocks away that had been there for decades, run by a man who came in at 5 in the morning every day without fail. He ordered a bowl of beef noodle soup and sat by the window. The broth was hot and the noodles were thick, and the restaurant was almost completely silent except for the sound of the owner moving around in the kitchen. He ate slowly and watched the city wake up through the window. On the same morning, Lieutenant Yuna was officially appointed as Earth's first galactic ambassador. The appointment was announced in a brief ceremony in the operations room at Defense Command that lasted 9 minutes. Daisu handed her the formal credentials document, shook her hand, and said 3 words, "Don't embarrass us." She smiled, folded the document, and put it in her jacket pocket. She had a transport to catch. Admiral Veron submitted his resignation to the Drakai Empire's High Command 2 weeks after the fleet returned home. His letter was short. He did not explain himself at length. He said only that the campaign had not achieved its objectives, and that he took full responsibility for the outcome. He listed no excuses. He named no one else. He signed his name at the bottom and sent it. The resignation was accepted without comment. He was not prosecuted. He had broken no law. He had carried out the orders of the Galactic Council faithfully, and had, when things went wrong, maintained discipline and prevented any escalation that could have resulted in actual combat. Those were not the actions of a criminal. They were the actions of a professional who had met a situation he could not overcome and had handled that situation with restraint. He retired to a small residence on one of his homeworld's quieter coastlines. He walked in the mornings, read in the afternoons, and spoke very little to anyone. Occasionally, former colleagues visited. He was always polite. He did not discuss the Earth campaign with anyone. He thought about it often, though. He thought about the silence from Earth in the days before the fleet arrived. He thought about how certain he had been that the silence was fear. He had built a 40-year career on reading situations correctly, and he had read that one completely wrong. He did not regret the conclusion he had drawn. Given what he had known at the time, it had been the logical one. What he could not stop thinking about was the thing he had not known. The fact that Earth had been watching the galaxy for nearly 2 centuries, learning from it, preparing, and never once letting anyone see what was being built below the surface. That was not something you planned in a few years. That was something you decided, as a civilization, to commit to across generations. Something you passed down from one group of scientists and engineers and builders to the next, over and over, without public acknowledgement or reward, simply because you believed it was necessary. He had spent his career studying civilizations. He had thought he understood humanity. He had not understood it at all. Desu sat on the rooftop of Defense Command on the evening after the treaty was signed and the fleet had returned home, and the initial wave of communications and reports and briefings had finally slowed down enough for him to have an hour to himself. He sat in a plain chair that he had carried up from a storage room, and he looked at the sky. It was a clear night. The stars were very bright. They did not look different than they ever had, but he knew that the space between them was different now. The relationship between the small blue planet he was